Today is Good Shepherd Sunday in the Episcopal tradition. Every year on the fourth Sunday of Easter, we read some texts that talk about shepherds. And those texts are a little different every year, but one thing is always the same, and that is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. Now, if we had read it instead of singing it this morning, we would have read the translation you can find in the back of your Book of Common Prayer, but that's not the best translation. If you're reading Psalm 23, you really have to read it in the New King James. There is no other option. And the line that's been sticking with me this week is, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." We don't talk a lot about enemies, but enemies are a constant refrain throughout the Psalms. There are questions. Why do my enemies prosper? There are requests for deliverance, and sometimes requests for harsh and violent punishments to befall our enemies. Deliver me, O God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek, you break the teeth of the wicked. There are proclamations of God's victory over enemies. The enemies have vanished in everlasting ruins. Their cities you have rooted out. The very memory of them has perished. But Psalm 23 may be the only place in the Psalms where enemies show up at a dinner party. Now, I'll be honest. All my life, that's not how I imagined this psalm, the enemies at the dinner party. I imagined it this way. The psalmist is at the table with God, and the enemies are in the corner bound with ropes. I told that to a friend of mine recently, and she said, "That you imagined it that way tells me everything I need to know about you as a child." Perhaps I was a vindictive little kid. But I didn't just imagine it that way. I also imagined it as King David, who wrote this psalm, trying to escape King Saul's wrath and running through the woods and exhausted, and God stopping him and magicking a little bubble of protection there in the woods, a clearing in the forest, and setting a table there and telling David to sit down and rest. And all of Saul's soldiers somehow outside this bubble, not able to reach him, and watching as he eats. I think those are reasonable ways to imagine it, but lately I've been imagining it differently. I've been imagining those enemies seated at the table too. Maybe the God who gives us a future hope, a vision of a future hope that includes a feast on a mountain where a lion and lamb lay down next to each other, is a God who invites our enemies to the table. Maybe our enemies aren't bound in the corner, but picking up their forks and passing the potatoes. And maybe that's a sweet picture, but it's only a sweet picture as long as enemy feels more like a theoretical category than a real one, as it probably does for us. As far as I know, none of you are currently on the run from a political enemy who wants you dead. David was, though, when he wrote this psalm. And so for David, enemy meant a threat to his life. So when I say maybe the enemies are invited to the table, please don't hear me saying some kind of sweet pastoral lion and lamb kumbaya moment. Let us remove any sentimental glaze from this scene I'm setting. This is a wolf and a lamb. This is a Russian military leader and a Ukrainian civilian. This is an ICE agent and an undocumented immigrant. Pick your pairing. God brings the powerful and the vulnerable together, the predator and the prey, and says, "Eat. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." What does it mean? And what does it mean for us in this moment in our common life when we are more divided and divisive than ever? If part of God's tender care for us, part of the way God provides for us in intimate and personal and lavish ways, is that in those moments of provision, our enemies are there too. When you imagine yourself sitting down to eat with an enemy, I'm curious who you picture. Take a moment. What enemy are you picturing? Is it a politician whose policies seem to actively target your rights? A colleague who's always opposing you when it's decision time? A kid who bullies your kid? A family member who mistreats you? Take a moment and choose one. And imagine drawing near to the table with that person. How does it feel? How does it feel to draw near to the table with that person with God in the room too, with assurance of God's presence there? Now let me be clear, I'm not saying that any of us needs to invite an abuser or a violent enemy into our homes. I am only saying that when God sets the table, if God sets the table and brings you and an enemy there together, you need not fear, for God is with you. And at the very least, while we're eating together, God protects us from each other. And maybe at best, when we break bread together, God shows us to each other. We see the humanity and belovedness of even our enemies, and we can both be changed. I think there's another way we have to think about the enemy at the table, though. See, when we read the Psalms, we usually identify ourselves with the speaker of the psalm. So when I say, the Lord is my shepherd, I'm identifying with that person. I'm saying, God is my shepherd, mine. I'm the sheep. But we're not always the main character. And the people who wrote the Psalms were part of a small, seemingly insignificant tribe that struggled to survive after being enslaved and warring with other small tribes, and then being totally conquered by invading empires. Most of us have not had that kind of experience. The reality may be that today, in some ways, we have more in common with the psalmist's enemies, with members of those invading empires, than we do with the Israelites who wrote the Psalms. Like many middle-class Babylonians did, I'm sure, we often live our lives unaware of the effects that our choices might be having on our global neighbors, or even our local neighbors. Perhaps we need to realize that at some tables, we are not the vulnerable sheep, we are the wolves, the enemies. And we may need to spend some time imagining what it would be like to be seated at a table with people whose lives have been made worse because of our decisions. Either way, sheep or wolf, in a moment we will all come together to this table, our memorial of the table that Christ once set in the presence of his enemies. But before we do, we'll exchange the peace. We'll say, the peace of the Lord be always with you. It's a way of acknowledging that it is only through Christ and his peace that we can come together with forgiveness for our enemies and forgiveness for ourselves. Let me suggest one final way to think about that enemy at the table in Psalm 23. Perhaps there is only one person there, and it is you. And the table is an invitation to be honest about the reality that your worst enemy might dwell within. God sets the table in the presence of your pride, your judgmentalness, your desire for God to strike your enemies and give them a painful death. your closed mind, your fear or greed or illicit desires or white lies, God invites you to stop trying to hide the things you're ashamed of and to lay them out there on the table before him too. And there, in that moment of honesty, God sets the table. God anoints your head with oil. Your cup overflows.